Hello, everyone. I'm Cindy Runger, president of Seattle Rotary, and I'm happy to welcome you to our first Seattle Rotary meeting of December. We have a lot to cover this week, or this hour, but I first like to send out a special shout out to the Peace Builders Committee for putting together a great program this past weekend at the Duwamish tribe. It was held at their longhouse with members of the tribe and also the longtime chairwoman Hanson and Roberta Greer, Chief Scoggins, Linda Ruff, and so many other Rotarians made it a very memorable ceremony. Now, do we have a slide for that? So thank you to all the committee members and for all of your efforts on behalf of the club to spread peace. So let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. And today, we will learn about Enlightened Aging with Dr. Eric Larson. So please be seated for our district governor nominee and past president, Kathy Gibson, for the
Thank you, President Cindy. Well, today is a fitting day to recall life and legacy, to consider all stages of life, with a special emphasis on what we sometimes refer to as one's golden years. Personally, I'm going to reflect back on my mother, who was my role model for resilient and enlightening aging. And that was even before I had these words in my vocabulary or appreciated these concepts. We had a birthday party for my mother when she turned 75. It was fun. And at the time, I asked her, "Mom, what does it feel like to be 75? And without hesitation, she smiled and said to all of us, "I don't know. I still feel like 25 inside." And then she took my hand and smiled, and she said to all of us, "I hope it's the same for you." And so today, I want to extend her wish to all of us. In these recent days, our nation has been recalling the life of our 41st president. And some of my favorite imagery of his life, of President Bush's life, has been some of his bold birthday observances, including his annual skydive, even as recently as his 90th birthday. I've also reflected on the president's words, and in particular, as he articulated a vision for a better America. And you may recall he said, "We are an endless, enduring dream and 1,000 points of light." To my ears, that's a benediction to our nation. So may I invite us to bow our heads for a moment of remembrance to our past president, George Herbert Walker Bush, to appreciate his life of service and to celebrate his enlightened aging.
Now, our main program. We have Neal McReynolds to introduce our main program. So a few facts about Neal. Neal is retired from the corporate world as Senior Vice President of what is now Puget Sound Energy. He now consults with CEOs and boards and teaches in the MBA program at the UW. So a fun fact about Neal, as a journalism student at the U, he was hired to come to Rotary and write a story on the Rotary's main speaker for the Seattle Times, the PI, and also the Totem. And he eventually became president of this club. One more fun fact, and a timely one. George H.W. Bush was Neal's personal host at a small dinner party in Washington, D.C. earlier in Bush's career. Please help me welcome past President Neal McReynolds to the podium.
Well, thank you, Cindy. Tell you, I'm subbing for past President Laura Rehrman, who was scheduled to do the introduction. Laura sends her apologies. She had unexpected surgery yesterday. As she quipped, it's a good thing you need only one kidney. Laura is very disappointed that she couldn't introduce our speaker, Dr. Eric Larson, who was someone she had worked closely with at the Group Health Foundation. Laura and Rotarian Tracy Garland arranged for today's program. Well, 40 years ago, Dr. Larson, as a young physician, was hired as medical director at the new University of Washington Geriatric and Family Services Clinic. Physicians were beginning to realize that dementia and Alzheimer's disease would soon have significant effects on our aging society. Since then, Dr. Larson's career as both a practicing physician and a scientific researcher in aging has been embedded in the real lives of his patients and thousands of others he and his team have been studied. Today, Dr. Larson is a leading expert in the science of healthy aging. He is Vice President for Research and Healthcare Innovation for Kaiser Permanente in Washington, formerly Group Health Cooperative, and Executive Director of Kaiser Permanente Washington's Health Research Institute. Is a newly published book, Enlightened Aging, and his comments today may be especially relevant to the baby boom generation. But his life's work is really for people of all ages looking for encouragement and wise counsel in order to live a long, active life. I'd like to briefly add my own personal comments. I too have known Dr. Larson for a number of years. I've served with him on the board of Group Health Foundation, board that I chaired for the past 2 years. I've been very impressed with the research work he's done on age-related illnesses and the practical ideas that he has developed to deal with them. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Eric Larson.
Well, thanks, Neal, and thanks also to Tracy and Laura for arranging for me to be on your program. It's a great pleasure to look out on a lot of smiling faces and leaders in our community. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about a book that I've just written with my colleague Joan DeClaire, which is really a summary of research, being a son to parents who lived into their late 90s, and also to being a physician practicing at UW Medical Center since 1977. What I'd like to start, though, with is a story. And this is a woman named Evangeline Schuler. We'll call her Van. And her story is that about 10 years ago, we published a paper that showed that exercise would reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease by about 40%, regular exercise. And in those days, it was news because people hadn't really explored this in the rigorous way we can in our research studies. So the local TV station and the feed for the National said, we'd like to talk to somebody who could tell us about this story. And our staff and I decided, well, Van Schuler is perfect. She was 100 years old when this paper came out. And so one of our staff called and said, Van, would you like to come down and be on TV so we can talk about this study? And she and you come to tomorrow or the next day or something like that. And she said, oh, I'd love to come, but it has to be today. And she said, why? Why today? Well, I'm going to Argentina tomorrow. My daughters are taking me down to a tango festival. So Van went to Buenos Aires after dancing in front of the cameras, and her younger daughters, I'm told, were very jealous because all the Argentine men wanted to dance with Van rather than their daughters. Now, I tell this story because it's striking the way people can live astonishingly good lives into a very late age. And we'll come back to Van. But this is one of the most powerful kind of examples that we've learned from our research and from, I think, everyday common sense. And just so I let you know that I'm not talking about there's a magic bullet out there. There is none. We've been trying for years to find that fountain of youth. And in fact, aging happens. When I was sitting at my table, a couple of people said, well, I'm aging. And I almost said, and I did under my breath, well, what if you're not aging? You don't want to be not aging unless you're ready for that part of your life. So we shouldn't seek to deny aging, but we should seek to thrive as we age. And we shouldn't seek magic cures or extra surgeries or extra this, that, and the other thing, but we can be enlightened about it. So the approach we talk about is using the information that we have learned over the past really 40 years since people have researched aging well, and using that as a guide to things that one can do because we're enlightened, and using the information you have just from observing people like your parents or other friends and colleagues as we age. So the idea is enlightened aging is an activist approach to aging using knowledge and not buying into false hope. The study that we use for this is the Adult Changes in Thought study. I'm just curious, is anybody in the audience part of the ACT study? If you are, you can raise your hands. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We have a tremendous community here that volunteers to be in these studies. This study was started in 1986. And the cohort that we have now was collected in 1994. So it's been going for over 30 years. It's the longest study of its kind, probably in the world. In particular, it's got the largest population of people over the age of 85 and 90. And we've had a remarkable run of good luck in terms of the things we've learned. And partially it's because people like many of us in our community are willing to be part of the study. One of the reasons why this is important, especially this notion of learning more about people over the age of 90 and how they got there, is shown in this slide. What we see here is that in the years 2010 to 2050, the population over 90 is going to quadruple. I just came back from Japan, and those of you who read The Economist would note that Shinzo Abe has grappled with the policy of a 100-year-old society. They're realizing that people are going to live to be 100, and that's true because of this prediction. This is James Vopel, who's a demographer from northern Germany and Denmark, and he wrote that at the millennium, half the babies born in 2000, if current trends continue, that's a big if, of course, are going to live to see the next century. So just think about that. And think about that in the context of these numbers. These are numbers from Seattle, a project we call the Kame Project, but every other study that's done this has found the same results. If you look here, this is a rare condition, relatively rare at a young age, but when you hit 90 and 95, it becomes more common to be demented than not. So we clearly need to figure out ways to delay or prevent this disease as much as possible. And if we don't, it's going to be a real challenge, and Shinzo Abe was reflecting that in his policies to try to address it. So what do we know? A lot of what we learn, I think, is from what Brokaw called our greatest generation. These are my parents at the Oregon coast. We grew up in Portland, and they did not expect to live to be 97. My mother and my father, both late in life, I never planned to be this old. Nobody in my family has been this old. And because of that, they didn't think as much about what they're going to do to prepare for becoming old and live to be old. When I ask our research subjects, did you ever expect to live this long? They mostly say no. Did your parents live this long? No. This is what's happening across our society. And here's my parents back in 1953 when Dad came back from being up at Elmendorf during the Korean War. My mother was born on a ranch in Montana. So she grew up in a ranch environment where she was the woman of the house. She lost her mother in childbirth, and she became a lab tech, a mother, and then a librarian. She was not physically active. I was the director of University of Washington Medical Center for 13 years, and during that time, she started to break bones. She fell by hitting a gopher hole on the ranch at a wedding, and she broke a bone. And for the next 10 years, she broke a bone every year. And so I said, Mom, you got to come up to the U so we can figure out what's going on. She had osteoporosis, not surprisingly. She had an early menopause, and she was not very active. So she came up, she got a very good evaluation and placed on 5 or 6 drugs over time. Most of them, except for vitamin D and estrogen, were stopped because they had side effects. But over the next 20 or so years, she did not break a bone. Do you know why that happened? She didn't fall. She quit falling. The doctor who saw her and her nagging son started to tell her, Mom, you got to exercise. And so she began to walk every day and do leg lifts to strengthen her legs and did some balance training. And at the end of the day, she lived into her mid-late 90s. before she had to, quote, take to a wheelchair because she just couldn't move that much anymore. But I think that was more than anything else the thing that made a difference for her. So what is happening, and what might have been exemplified by my mom, but others, is we're beginning to see a compression of morbidity. The idea is, do we live long and have lots more time of being dependent on others, or do we live long and move that time of dependency as close to the time we die as possible? And one of the areas that I'm most interested in, of course, is Alzheimer's disease. And what we've found in the US from some studies that we've published recently, and also now in 4 or 5 other countries, is that the rate of Alzheimer's disease is going down. Yeah, the rate. I didn't say the number, I said the rate. The number of people with the condition is actually going up, but the rate is going down in advanced Western countries. It's actually going up in some countries which are Westernizing in the wrong way. And why is that? As people were born later in the 20th century, they had higher levels of education, they got better health care, their socioeconomic condition was better. In general, they just had better health. And they've also taken better care of their blood vessels by not smoking, by treating high blood pressure, by treating high cholesterol. And at the end of the day, this moves that time of when people get Alzheimer's disease later in the time course. And actually, in one of our studies, we showed that the number of people who die within 2 years of the disease is actually increasing, which says it's compressing closer towards the end of life. So there's a lot of hope because this condition is much more malleable to enlightened aging, if you will, than otherwise. I'm going to give a few findings from our study just to give you a flavor. We published, believe it or not, over 500 refereed scientific papers over these many years we've had the study, and many of these papers are thanks to my fine colleagues who work with me at the university and at Kaiser Permanente, formerly Group Health. So falls in footwear. I told the story of my mother. She fell and was breaking bones. One of the earliest things we showed was that people with dementia have dramatically higher risk of falling, but that this risk is made worse by certain drugs that people were taking and by essentially poor care, if you will. I think that's improved, and people are, in fact, falling less. Later on, we showed that to avoid falls, one of the things that you might do is have a shoe that's less prone to fall. And we asked the question, do you slip or do you trip? And that was a legitimate question at the time we asked it. And what we found was that people are more likely to slip and fall than trip. And the story I like to tell is one of the volunteers in this study would go skiing at Snoqualmie in his 70s or 80s. And he called us, I fell. And so we sent a technician up there to measure the coefficient of friction of his ski and the snow, and sure enough, it was slippery. A week later, he fell again. He called dutifully. We went back up again, and finally we said, sir, you do not need to call anymore. Once or twice is plenty fine. But what I would tell my parents would be to say, put a set of slippers with a good sole next to your bed when you get up and go to the bathroom. And I'd put something on rather than walking in bare feet or stocking feet. Those are the most dangerous times for many people. Drug effects. Certain drugs cause dementia. Fortunately, I think we're using them less, but one of the most important papers I wrote was called Adverse Drug Reactions Causing Cognitive Impairment in Older Patients. Other drugs can maybe help you. So statins, the drugs we take for high cholesterol, were shown in one of our studies to reduce the plaques and tangles that are in the brains of people who have Alzheimer's disease when they die. Other findings are on this slide, and I'll just point out the top one. There's the disease Alzheimer's is characterized by a deficit in chemicals that transmit impulses in the brain, acetylcholine. There are lots of drugs that are acetylcholine inhibitors, and they can cause confusion. But one of the things we showed, which got a lot of attention a few years ago, is that if you take high doses of these drugs, they not only cause temporary effects, but they can cause a permanent increase in your risk of dementia. So there's a lot of work being done now on either finding safer drugs to use for these conditions or trying to keep the doses as low as possible. This is probably one of the most important slides that we've had in our journey of discovery. This is what a brain looks like in a person with Alzheimer's disease. These are plaques and tangles. The tangles are the little spindly things, and the plaque is the big brown blob. And one of the things we discovered a few years ago is that a person with a brain like this, who if you saw only the brain under the microscope, you'd say that person has Alzheimer's disease. In fact, there are quite a number of people who have these plaques and tangles when they die at 90 or 95, but don't have Alzheimer's disease. We call this phenomena resilience. The idea that some people are resilient to these pathologic changes in life. And it's one of the most interesting areas that we're working on now to try to figure out, rather than studying the bad things like Alzheimer's disease, let's study how some people resist this into their 90s and 95. We've never been able to do this because there's never been so many people that live to be 90 and 95. Some other findings are shown on this slide right here. And I think in the interest of time, I won't spend too much time, but these are important findings, especially this idea that people with higher blood sugars are more likely to become demented. So any level of blood sugar that's higher than the level below it confers a greater risk. This is important for public health. And remember Mayor Bloomberg, he made rules in New York essentially saying no high content sugar beverages. We won't sell these giant Slurpees or whatever. And in fact, that kind of a move lowered the blood sugar on the average of New York. And according to this study, that should actually lead to a further compression of morbidity. Again, back to the physical activity. This is the study that led to Van Schuler's appearance on TV and before her trip to Argentina, and it's about a 40% risk. And for those of you who are exercisers or not, the risk is driven more by not exercising than by how much exercise you do. So from a public health perspective, if we could just get up and move more, we'd be a lot better off. And then some other aspects of physical activity. The disease dementia, when it often comes first with a slowdown in physical activity. That's one of the first manifestations of dementia in many people. And the last little bullet here is some of the programs like Lifetime Fitness, Silver Sneakers. If you look at the participants in those programs, they actually cost less. And that's why health insurance companies like Kaiser, like Group Health formerly, and others are subsidizing membership in clubs and activity programs. It's a good deal for those who are paying the bill. So the point of the book is how do we become resilient to the things that are going to happen to us with aging, and how do we become enlightened about building that resilience? Because if you build the resilience, you can be like a tree that bends but doesn't break in the wind. This is another story. This is Ben Stevenson. He was a professor back in the Midwest, moved out here, became one of my patients, and in his 90s, he was taking care of his Arabian horses. This was his hobby. And somehow he got tangled in a lunge line, and the horse started dragging him around. And I got a call from his daughter and say, he's at the hospital, he looks bad. And I went in the next morning to see him, and he really looked bad. He was covered with bruises. At his age, I said to myself, boy, this is not going to end well. This is probably the thing that's going to tip him over the edge. In fact, just the opposite happened. He was only a couple days on the inpatient wards, less than a week in the rehab ward, and only a month or two in a rehab facility. So he bounced back. He didn't go back to horseback riding, but he lived many years after this fall. and resumed essentially a normal life. I was at his 100th birthday party, and he was a poet. He loved to write poetry, and so he wrote poetry. He'd built resilience throughout his life. He was very active as a kid. He educated himself, first of all, became a teacher, then became a PhD, and then a professor. In later life, he would revise his textbook, he exercised, and he stayed socially active. And at his 100th birthday, he had a doggerel poem about the past, present, and future. It was a long poem, and it was very funny. So this is the idea. You expect that as we age, things will happen to us. And I'm sure there's not a person in the room who hasn't had something they had to recover from. And the idea is like this tree along the coast. You bend, but you don't break. And you bounce back as much as possible. This is Van Schuler again. So when she retired, she was a social worker. She was at Hull House in Chicago, if people know that, the founding institution for social work. She and her husband went to India on the Peace Corps. And about 18 months into the stay, he got meningitis and died. And she came back, began to take care of affairs, but rather than retreating and breaking, she went back and completed her course and eventually stayed very active. She would ride the bus around Seattle. Eventually she moved to the Midwest to be closer to her daughters and back to their home and into a facility. As she lost her vision, she loved to read, so she listened to books. As she became part of the community, she had a breakfast table. And the breakfast table was, you can sit at my table if you bring a joke. So every morning, this group of people at her table came with a joke. You might think about that for Rotary, too. It's a joke. We now have our research meetings. We have to have at least one joke before we talk about anything like business. But in any case, she lived until she was, 107, and had very little time when she was inactive and dependent on others. So that's how you build this. And I think this is where I want to put in a pitch for what we're advocating. We call it the path to build resilience. And it starts with proactivity, which means being an activist ager. It includes the notion of acceptance. You don't deny that you're aging, but you accept and adapt to what's happening. And you build reserves in the three domains: physical, mental, and social. And early on, a lot of our research on Alzheimer's disease is all about building cognitive reserve. You build cognitive reserve when you become educated. When a society becomes more highly educated, they build cognitive reserve. So let me go into a few of these ideas. So proactivity, I think it's really important that you take an active role and not believe that aging is a downward spiral. One of the quotes that I like to give is, do people remember Pete Townsend? Yeah, The Who, right? Remember what he would say in talking about my generation? Boy, it sure looks cold. Hope I die before I get old. You know what Pete Townsend is doing now? He's blogging about aging and how wonderful it is to age. So we have this idea that we shouldn't age. We don't want to age, but in fact we are going to age, and it's a sign of success when we do age. And we can modify our risk by doing some of the things that we talk about in the book. The idea of taking an active role, this slide is something that this is just good health. But the more good health we have in our community, the better our health is going to be. It seems like a truism here. This is the idea of shared decision-making. I have a story to tell here, but I'll tell it afterwards if anybody wants to hear it, about some of the things we do as doctors to people who maybe shouldn't have them because they're not helping them. The routines. Acceptance is extremely important. The idea that successful aging is somehow not aging. This is a study we did in the Japanese population in the Kame Project, and in the, I'm running out of time here, aren't I? Thank you. In the Caucasian population. The point of this study is that everybody doesn't really want to just live longer, they want to live better. And acceptance, I think I put in too many slides, so I apologize for this, but this is a really interesting study. This is the happiness levels at different ages. Happiness actually declines into middle age and late middle age, and then it keeps going up, and it gets higher and higher. We've never found an age that wasn't happier than the younger age. So I'm going to wrap things up here. I have copies of these slides, and they're going to be available, I'm sure, on your website. But we're building these 3 reservoirs. I think they should be self-evident to you. I want to get to the very end here and close out with these 3 reservoirs and mention the importance of balance exercising. As you get older, balance exercise is really important. So the last thing I'm going to say here is to give you a quote from Simone de Beauvoir, which I can hardly read. There's only one solution if old age is not to be an absurd parody of our former life, and that is to go on pursuing ends that give our existence meaning. That's what we learned from our surveys. Devotion to individuals, to groups, or to causes, social, political, and intellectual. And I think that's very appropriate for a club like Rotary, and especially this chapter. Thank you very much.
So in closing, I thought this would be a fitting Italian proverb for the holidays and the topic on hand on enlightened aging. Age and glasses of wine should never be counted. So sure, it's a good excuse to drink wine, but it's also an invitation to enjoy life fully. Revel in the company of good friends and Rotarians, exercise, tell jokes, and also enjoy good wine, but not too much. See you all next week. We are adjourned.